we have been able to address and discuss some important and cogent topics that revolves around fine art. And when we are talking about fine art also, especially in considering the fact that we are an African country, we have to look at topic from that are well discussed the African art culture. So this is what we'll be doing in this module. We'll be introducing ourselves to different African arts that we have over there. That we have. So now we have the module of the contents. One, we'll be looking at the scope of African culture. After that, we'll be looking at the scope of African culture, where we'll be mainly discussing what African culture looks like and what it means mainly. Then we'll move on to differences between African culture and the European culture. African art and European art. Sorry about that. Now, in this, we'll be trying to we'll be comparing African art from that of the European art to see the key differences between these two arts. Then afterwards, we'll move on to materials and techniques in African art. So where we'll be looking at different materials and different that is used in for African art, and different techniques that is being used to achieve different arts in Africa. Then afterwards, we'll also move on the major arts producing cultures and regions in Africa, mainly addressing the major topics. Major countries and regions that are producing arts producing art culture in Nigeria, in Africa. Which Nigeria happens to be one of them. Then afterwards, we'll move on to art forms and objects, and finally, we'll be looking at the influences and themes in African art. These are the subtopics that we'll be looking at for this module, African art culture. Now let's move on to the introduction. Let's introduce ourselves to what African art culture is. So in this module, we are going to it is important to note that in this module, African art culture, it actually represents one of the richest and most diverse creative traditions in human history, encompassing the visual expression of countless communities across the continent, Africa, from ancient times to the present. So it is rooted deeply in social, spiritual, and communal life rather than individual aesthetic pursuits. So African art is mainly functional. That is one of the main things that should be beeping at the back of our mind. That African art is not just for the fun of it or just for an individual pursuit or anything like that. It is functional, very, very functional. It has to do. African art is definitely saying something. So it's left to the audience to any art in Africa is passing across an information and saying something and depicting the culture of Africa. So this is what we are trying to establish here, that it is fundamentally functional, and it is serving to honor the ancestors, to invoke deities, mark rites of passage, reinforce political authority, educate young, and maintain cosmic balance. Now, artists draw from locally available materials, they actually draw from locally available materials like wood, ivory, terracotta, bronze, iron, clay, raw fibers, beads, and natural pigments, and master sophisticated techniques such as carving, lost wax, casting, modeling, weaving, dyeing, and beadwork to create objects that are alive with meaning. Emphasis on that meaning. So all these things, although we can see it as okay, they are just tools and materials, but however, what these materials are used to produce definitely has meaning. So in whichever form it is passing through, whether it is through dyeing, it is through weaving, it is through modeling or casting or beadwork or whatever, it actually has meaning and it is alive. So masks and masquerade, sculptures and figurines, textiles, body adornments, shrine architecture, and everyday objects like stools and headdress, they all carry layered symbolism, often encompassing conceptual representation over naturalism, with altered proportion, abstraction, and motifs that convey ideas of fertility, power, protection, duality, and spiritual forces. Now, we cannot separate, when we are talking about African art, we can't actually separate it from spirituality. So it is more like because that is where it's mainly originated from. It's talking about masquerades and all beads and all these things. So we can actually separate we can actually talk about African art and separate it from spirituality. It is more of like they are interconnected. So it is more of that, like the rituals, the sacrifices, the spirituality that art in Africa is actually portraying. So what we are trying to establish here in this introduction is that Art in Africa, it encompasses different visual experience of countless communities, countless cultural background, different cultural background come together to depict a message, a societal and also a spiritual and communal life that African is actually passing through. It's not just for the fun of it or for individual pursuits alone, but it is more of like depicting what the culture and African is. Now let's move on to the scope of African art. What do we refer to as scope of African art now? It refers to the diverse creative expression that is produced by peoples of the African continent, spanning thousands of years and encompassing a wide range of forms, styles, and purposes. Unlike much of Western art, which often prioritizes aesthetic beauty or individual expression for its own sake, African art is deeply rooted in the daily life, beliefs, and social structures of its creator. Now, African art is more just like we are trying to establish it to compare it to the Western art that is more just for beauty, for individual expression, aesthetic, or for the fun of it. African art, was the other art, is very deeply rooted in the daily life, the beliefs and social structure of the creator. Now, it's African art serves as practical functions rather than existing purely as decoration or objects. It is not just a decoration. Art in Africa is not just for decoration, but it is for practical functions to be displayed in isolation. Now, the scope of African art is vast, covering sculpture, painting, textiles, architecture, body adornments, and performance. African art reflects the continent's cultural diversity, how diverse the culture the continent is, with each region and ethnic group developing distinctive styles influenced by environments, by history and worldview. Now, African art, it also differs from European tradition in its integration and with ritual and ceremony. Objects are frequently created for specific occasions. Yes, different arts, African artistic or different arts are created for a specific occasion and may lose their power or relevance once the event concludes. This is the how powerful African art is. So this functional approach underscores that African art is not merely an object, but an active participant in social and spiritual life. This is what I was trying to establish in our when we are introducing ourselves to this work, that talking about African art, you can actually separate it from the spiritual life, although it is also serving as socially, but the spirituality is more in depth and more deeper. So that is what African art is all about. So now let's move on to the differences between African art and the European art. We try to compare and contrast the differences to look at the distinction between the African art and European art. These arts, African and European art, they represent two distinct different traditions entirely, and it's actually shaped by fundamental different cultural values, worldviews, and historical context. African art, particularly in its traditional form, is deeply integrated into the spiritual, social, and communal life of its creator, whereas European art has historically evolved toward individual expression, aesthetic contemplation, and technical innovation, often detached from ritual function. One of the primary differences lies in the purpose and function. That's one of the main difference when we are talking about the distinction between African art and European art. The purpose and function. Traditional African art is predominantly utilitarian and performative, and it is created to serve specific religious, ceremonial, political, or educational roles within the community. Mask, sculpture, and textile are designed to invoke ancestors, honor deities, mark rites of passage, enforce social forms, and the likes. While in contrast, on the other hand, much of European art, especially from the Renaissance onward, it mainly prioritizes aesthetic beauty. We can actually see the difference now. It's just actually depicting beauty for the fun of it, personal expression, and intellectual exploration for its own sake. Now, finally, context and reception highlights further contrast. The context and the reception is another difference. African arts are typically inseparable from their cultural and performative environments. Removed to museums, they lose part of their original meaning and power, while European artwork, especially in the modern era, are created with portability and display in mind, just to display, to show beauty, designed to stand alone as objects of contemplation, while African art is there, like is there to depict what the that it is inseparable from their cultural and performative environments. Now let's look at the materials and techniques in African art. What are the different materials that are being used to produced in African art to produce art in Africa. We have the creation of African art demonstrates remarkable resourcefulness as artists traditionally use locally available materials that are often organic and tied to the natural environment. Now, common materials include wood. Well, wood is very common, which is widely favored for carving masks and figures due to its workability and availability in forested regions. Ivory from elephant tusks also, and elephant tusks is also used. We can also use that. Used for intricate carvings in coastal and central areas. Terracotta or clay for pottery, anything that has to do with pottery, clay is used for that. And sculptural heads, metals such as bronze, brass, and iron for casting, and natural fibers for weaving textiles. Other materials include beads, shells, raffia, leather, feathers, and pigments. These are the different materials that we use it for in African art. So techniques actually vary by the region and purpose, but it reflects sophisticated knowledge that is being passed down through generation from one generation to the other. Carving is one of the most widespread methods, involving the removal of material from wood or ivory to create masks, figures, and utensils. Lost wax casting is a complex bronze working technique. It was actually mastered in ancient centers like Igbo and Benin, where molten metal is poured into molds formed around wax models. Now let's move on to major art producing cultures and regions in Africa. Now, Africa's artistic heritage is richly diverse, with major art producing cultures distributed across its geographic regions. Now, West Africa stands out as one of the most prolific areas, home of ancient civilizations that actually produce sophisticated terracotta and bronze work. Now, these regions include the following: we have the Yoruba, Igbo, and Edo peoples of Nigeria, as well as groups in Mali, Ghana, and Senegal that they are known for masks, ancestral figures, and court arts that emphasize hierarchy and spirituality. Central Africa, encompassing areas like the Congo Basin and Gabon, they features powerful wooden sculptures and reliquary figures created by groups such as the Fang and Congo, often designed to house ancestral spirits. East Africa, on the other hand, they contribute distinctive tradition, including intricate beadwork and body adornments of Maasai and Kikuyu communities in Kenya and Tanzania, alongside Asian rock paintings. Southern Africa is renowned for the rock arts of the San people. Ancient rock paintings. South Africa is for the San people, which depicts hunting scenes and spiritual visions using natural pigments, while West Africa receives particular emphasis in many studies due to its well-preserved ancient works and influence on global art history. Now, all regions share common traits of functionality and symbolism. That is very common. Now, trade, mitigation, and cultural exchange have historically linked these areas, allowing styles and motifs to travel and evolve across the continent. Now let's move on to the next subtopic, which is art forms and objects. African art actually manifests in a wide array of forms and objects, each serving specific cultural, religious, or social purposes within communities. Masks and masquerade are among the most iconic used in ceremonies to embody spirits, ancestors, or mythical beings. They are often worn with elaborate costumes and performed in dances that educate, entertain, or enforce social norms. Sculptures and figurines, they range from small fertility dolls to large ancestral statues representing deities, leaders, or protective forces, and are frequently placed in shrines or homes. Body art, including scarification, painting, and elaborate hairstyling, actually transform the human form into a canvas for expressing identity, status, beauty, or rite of passage. Now let's look at influences and themes in African art. Now the themes and influences in African art profoundly shaped by continent spiritual, social and environmental realities. Religion and spirituality form the dominant influence when we are talking about African art, with much art dedicated to honoring ancestors, appeasing deities, or facilitating communication with the supernatural being. Now, ancestral worship believe in spirits inhabiting natural forces, and divination practices inspire objects that serve as vessels for spiritual power, such as reliquary figures or divination words. Symbolism permits African art where motifs like animals, geometric patterns, or human forms, they actually carry layered meanings related to fertility, protection, strength, or balance. Now, in conclusion, African art culture stand as a profound testament to the ingenuity, resilience, and spiritual depth of the continent's people, uh, weaving together functionality, symbolism, and communal purpose into a vibrant tapestry that transcends mere aesthetics. Now, from the ancient masterpiece of Nok terracotta and Benin bronzes to the intricate marks, textile, and body adornment that continue to thrive in ceremonial contexts, this tradition underscores a worldview where art is not an isolated pursuit but an essential force for maintaining social harmony, honoring the sacred, and navigating the complexity of existence. It contrasts with European art's diverse human expression, one rooted in collective ritual and conceptual abstraction. The other often in individual innovation and naturalistic representation, enriching global understanding of creativity without hierarchy. So I believe with this mode we have been able to extremely compare and contrast the difference between African art and European art, and also look at African art and the different materials that is being used and the